You've probably met someone who never seems to be at fault for anything. When things go wrong, there's always someone else to point to. Always an explanation that shifts the spotlight away from them. Psychology suggests this pattern isn't random, and understanding why it happens reveals something profound about emotional development and human behavior. Welcome back. If you find value in understanding the patterns that shape human behavior, consider subscribing. It helps us continue exploring these topics together. Today, we're examining a pattern that affects relationships, workplaces, and personal growth. Why some people consistently shift blame to others, and what this reveals about emotional maturity. Emotional immaturity isn't a clinical diagnosis. It's a psychological concept that describes someone whose emotional responses and coping mechanisms haven't fully developed beyond childhood patterns. Research indicates that emotional maturity involves several key capacities: the ability to regulate one's emotions, tolerate discomfort, accept responsibility, and maintain perspective during stress. When these capacities remain underdeveloped, certain predictable patterns emerge. Blame shifting is one of the most recognizable. It's the reflexive tendency to deflect responsibility for mistakes, conflicts, or negative outcomes onto other people or circumstances. This isn't the same as identifying genuine contributing factors in a situation. When something goes wrong, multiple factors are often at play. The distinction lies in the pattern and the intent. Someone who is emotionally mature can acknowledge their role alongside other factors. Someone operating from emotional immaturity struggles to hold any self-critical awareness, even momentarily. The deflection is automatic, immediate, and often lacks logical consistency. To understand this pattern, we need to explore what's happening beneath the surface. Psychology suggests that blame shifting serves a protective function. The human ego, or sense of self, experiences certain emotions as threats. Shame and guilt, in particular, can feel overwhelming when someone hasn't developed the internal capacity to process them. Research on cognitive dissonance shows that humans experience psychological discomfort when holding two conflicting ideas simultaneously. For example, seeing oneself as a good person while recognizing one has caused harm creates tension. The emotionally mature response involves integrating both truths. I am generally a good person, and I made a mistake that hurt someone. But for those with less developed emotional regulation, this tension feels intolerable. Blame shifting resolves this discomfort instantly. By externalizing fault, the internal conflict disappears. The self-image remains intact. The uncomfortable feelings dissipate. This mechanism operates largely outside conscious awareness. The person isn't typically thinking, "I'll blame someone else to protect my ego." Instead, their mind automatically constructs a narrative where they are not at fault, and this narrative feels genuinely true to them. Developmental psychology points to early environment as significant in shaping these patterns. Children learn emotional regulation primarily through relationships with caregivers. When a child makes a mistake, how adults respond shapes their internal framework. If mistakes are met with disproportionate anger, harshness, or withdrawal of love, the child learns that being at fault is dangerous. They internalize the message that errors threaten their value and safety. Alternatively, if a child is never held accountable and consistently has their behavior excused or justified by parents, they don't develop the neural pathways for self-reflection and responsibility. Both extremes can produce adults who struggle with accountability, though through different mechanisms. The common thread is a deficit in emotional regulation skills. When someone hasn't learned to sit with uncomfortable feelings like guilt, shame, or inadequacy, these emotions trigger a fight-or-flight response. Blame becomes the fight response. Attack outward rather than look inward. This pattern becomes reinforced over years, eventually operating as the default setting. These dynamics play out across all areas of life. In personal relationships, this pattern creates a particular kind of exhaustion. Imagine a common scenario. A couple has planned to meet at a specific time, and one person arrives significantly late without communication. When the other expresses frustration, the late partner's immediate response is, "Well, if you hadn't insisted on this restaurant across town, I would have been on time." Or, "You're always so uptight about schedules. That's the real problem here." The original issue, arriving late without notice, disappears under a counter-accusation. The person who was kept waiting now finds themselves defending their reaction rather than receiving an acknowledgement of the initial behavior. This pattern, repeated across hundreds of interactions, erodes trust and intimacy. Partners of blame shifters often describe a feeling of disorientation, questioning their own perceptions because the narrative gets rewritten so consistently. The fundamental issue is never addressed because it's never acknowledged. Workplace environments reveal these patterns differently. Consider a team project with a looming deadline. One team member hasn't completed their portion, putting the entire project at risk. When this is addressed in a meeting, their response might be, "I wasn't given clear enough instructions." Or, "If the timeline had been more reasonable from the start, this wouldn't be an issue." Or even, "Other people's delays affected my ability to complete my part." There may be grains of truth in any of these statements. Projects do have multiple contributing factors, but the consistent pattern is an inability to say, "I didn't manage my time well," or "I should have communicated earlier that I was struggling." Every explanation points outward. The language patterns are particularly revealing. Phrases like, "You made me feel," or "if you hadn't," or "I only did that because you," structure causality in a specific way. They position the speaker as purely reactive, with no autonomous choice. Psychology recognizes this as an external locus of control, the belief that one's life is primarily controlled by outside forces rather than one's own decisions. Research indicates this belief system correlates with various negative outcomes, including lower life satisfaction and reduced personal growth. The shame-blame cycle offers insight into why this pattern persists. Shame, as researchers distinguish it from guilt, is the feeling that something is wrong with oneself fundamentally, not just that one made a mistake. It's the difference between "I did something bad" and "I am bad." Shame is among the most painful human emotions, often described as feeling exposed, small, or worthless. For someone without the tools to process shame, its emergence triggers panic. Blame serves as an immediate exit from shame. By constructing a narrative where someone else is at fault, shame is converted into anger or indignation. These emotions, while uncomfortable, feel more manageable and less threatening to the sense of self. Anger provides a sense of power and righteousness that shame lacks. The person who moments ago might have felt the creeping sensation of shame now feels justified, even victimized. The emotional transformation is dramatic and reinforcing. This is where the external locus of control becomes entrenched. If outcomes are always someone else's fault, there's no incentive to change one's own behavior. The belief system becomes, "My life would be fine if other people acted differently." This creates a particular kind of stuckness. Psychological research on learned helplessness shows that when people believe they have no control over outcomes, they stop trying to affect change. Paradoxically, by refusing accountability, the person loses the very thing that could improve their circumstances: the power to make different choices. Another factor is often at play: limited emotional vocabulary. Studies in emotional intelligence emphasize the importance of being able to identify and name specific feelings. Someone with high emotional literacy might recognize, "I'm feeling defensive because this criticism touched on an insecurity I have about my competence." This awareness creates space for a more measured response. But someone with limited emotional vocabulary experiences a more generalized, overwhelming sense of feeling bad when challenged or criticized. Without the ability to differentiate and name the feeling, the only response available is to make it stop. Blame achieves this by redirecting focus away from the self. The consequences of this pattern extend in multiple directions. For relationships, the impact is particularly corrosive. Trust requires a foundation of reliability and accountability. When someone never acknowledges their role in conflicts or problems, trust erodes steadily. Partners, friends, or family members begin to feel that honest communication is impossible because it will always be turned back on them. They may start avoiding difficult conversations entirely, which creates distance and resentment. Research on relationship satisfaction consistently identifies the ability to repair after conflict as crucial. This requires both parties to acknowledge their contributions, however unequal they might be in a given situation. When one person cannot or will not do this, repair becomes impossible. Conflicts don't resolve, they just fade until the next one erupts. Over time, this pattern often leads to relationship dissolution or to relationships that persist but lack genuine intimacy. For the person engaging in blame shifting, the costs are perhaps less visible but equally significant. Personal growth requires honest self-assessment. It demands the willingness to recognize where one's behavior isn't serving them or others, and to make changes accordingly. This entire process is foreclosed when someone operates from the belief that problems originate outside themselves. They remain locked in repetitive patterns, confused about why relationships keep failing or why workplace conflicts follow them from job to job. The common denominator, their own behavior, remains invisible to them. There's also a quieter cost, the loss of authentic self-knowledge. When someone spends years constructing narratives that protect their ego, they lose touch with who they actually are. The gap between their self-concept and reality widens. This can manifest as a pervasive sense that something is wrong, that life isn't working, but without any clear understanding of why. The very mechanism meant to protect them from painful feelings ends up creating chronic dissatisfaction. For those in close proximity to consistent blame shifters, the experience is often described as emotionally exhausting. Being blamed for things you didn't do, or having your legitimate concerns deflected and turned into accusations against you, creates a specific kind of stress. Over time, people in these relationships may begin to doubt their own perceptions and judgments. They might accept responsibility for things that genuinely aren't their fault, simply to avoid the conflict that comes with pushing back. This dynamic can be damaging to their own sense of self and their ability to trust their own reality. Understanding these patterns doesn't mean excusing the behavior or accepting its impact on our lives. There's an important distinction between compassion and enabling. We can recognize that someone developed these patterns as a way of coping with overwhelm they experienced earlier in life, perhaps in childhood. We can understand that they're operating from a place of emotional limitation rather than malice. And simultaneously, we can maintain boundaries and refuse to accept blame that isn't ours to carry. Perhaps the most important insight is that this pattern, like all patterns of emotional immaturity, isn't fixed. Neuroscience research confirms that the brain retains plasticity throughout life. People can develop new emotional capacities at any age if they're willing to do the work. This requires first recognizing the pattern in oneself, which is often the hardest step. It requires tolerating the discomfort of self-examination and slowly building the capacity to sit with difficult feelings rather than immediately deflecting them. For those of us observing these patterns in others, the question becomes, what role do we want to play? We cannot change another person's behavior, but we can choose how we respond to it. We can stop accepting blame that isn't ours. We can maintain our own clarity about what happened, even when someone insists on a different narrative. And we can make informed decisions about how much energy to invest in relationships where accountability remains absent. The patterns we've explored today exist on a spectrum. Most of us probably recognize moments when we've deflected responsibility, times when accepting fault felt too threatening. The question isn't whether we're perfect, but whether we're willing to see these moments clearly and grow from them. That willingness, more than anything else, marks the difference between emotional maturity and its absence. What's been your experience with this dynamic, either in yourself or in relationships with others? The comment section is open for thoughtful discussion. And if this analysis brought clarity to patterns you've observed, consider subscribing for more explorations of human behavior. Thanks for watching.